is going to be about 2 long-term studies that we've been conducting down in southern Ohio in the hill country. And it's going to have a focus on oak regeneration and stand structure, but we'll also cover a little bit on plant diversity and the response of understory plants to fire. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on this, Joanne Rebbeck, who helped prepare the presentation. All right. Well, in lots of areas in southern Ohio and also in other areas where we have oak-dominated forests, the forests of today, especially in mature forests, tend to look a lot like this in many places where we have an oak overstory, but the understory tends to be dominated by shade-tolerant species like red maple, sugar maple, beech, black gum. And that is reflected in the latest forest inventory and analysis survey of Ohio that was published in 2011. And you can see these are the diameters of the trees on the x-axis, and then the percentage of those trees on the y-axis, comparing just 2 groups, the oaks and the maples. And basically, the larger trees in most of those FIA plots, this is for the whole state of Ohio, tend to be the oaks, while the smaller trees, the saplings and the poles, tend to be the maples and other shade-tolerant species. And when these larger trees are either die or are harvested, or there's a natural disturbance, they tend to be replaced in these stands by the species in the pole and sapling class, which are generally these shade-tolerant species. And this varies quite a bit across the landscape based on landscape position and also the land use history. But generally here on the drier and more intermediate sites in the hill country, these would be the ridge tops and south-facing slopes, there are plenty of oak seedlings. They don't tend to get very big on the forest floor. But then when you move down into the mesic sites, these lower north-facing slopes and ravines, or just richer stands, tend to have, even though there might be oak in the overstory, there's lots of competition from herbaceous plants and shrubs in the understory, and there may not be very many oak seedlings at all, even though the overstory is dominated by oak. All right, just to compare some long-term trends here, this is a study done by Jim Dyer at Ohio University and myself that we're working on. And we're comparing what the original forests were like about 1800 based on witness tree surveys. And this is for 5 counties in southern Ohio with the FIA data, the current forest inventory for those same 5 counties in upland forests. And you can see that back in 1800, 1 out of every 3 trees was a white oak, Quercus alba. There was a lot of hickory and black oak and beech, and all of these mass-producing species are significantly less abundant now in today's forests, and particularly white oak has just declined so much from being being the dominant species to now only making up 7% of the trees. And we look at the species that have increased over that time. Red maple was only 3% of the witness trees back in 1800 and is now 12%. We've had a similar increase in sugar maple, an increase in yellow poplar, and some other soft mass species such as cherry, aspen, ash, elm, and then buckeye. So all these species, so we really see there's been some dramatic changes in species composition in the forests in southern Ohio. And there's really for a long time there's been this theory, this hypothesis that it's been the decline in wildfire that has really facilitated that's been a major cause of the changes in species composition. And way back in 1971, Ben Roach, who's a forester at an oak symposium, wrote that the decline in wildfire has permitted the invasion of oak stands by more mesic species. I can think of no other factor to account for many acres of good sites that now support well-stocked, rapidly maturing oak stands whose understories contain much reproduction of tolerant species, but practically no oaks. All right, and we've done some fire history and stand dynamics work down at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest when there was a silvicultural a treatment of thinning. We went in and collected basal cross sections from both the oaks and the maple trees in that stand to look at the fire history that was documented by fire scars in the oaks, and then to also look at when those trees established, what was the first year that those trees were there. And you can see this was a pretty old stand. We had oaks here are the brown. This is the number of trees that established, and there was an establishment event back around the Civil War, 1850s and 1860s, and that was when probably those stands were cut for the charcoal iron industry. There was a furnace, the Vinton Furnace was very close to that. And each one of these arrows then that we have is representing a dated fire that occurred in these stands based on the oaks. You can see that we had 7 fires from 1878 up to 1932. Fire suppression began in 1923, and that was also the year of the last major fire. But what we see is we had a long period where we don't record any tree establishment, and this may have been a combination of the fact that the stands were closing in and that we had these fires, and also there might have been grazing in the woods. But then beginning when we had a fire in 1917, you can see there was some oak recruitment again, and also in the fire in 1923. But after that last major fire, a fire that scarred, a significant number of trees in the stand, after that time, we only had maple recruitment. No more oak recruitment was documented. So it gets at that history of once the fires stopped was really the time when that facilitated the maples and other species really getting established and coming into these stands. Now, one thing we really don't have a good handle on yet, or really no handle, is what the pre-settlement or pre-European fire history was in southern Ohio. And we're just beginning. We're collaborating with Mike Stanbaugh at the University of Missouri to try to get that history to go farther back. How often were fires occurring in the 1700s and early 1800s? And we've been working at Shawnee State Forest, where you can see in this historic photograph there was quite a bit of pine, pitch pine and shortleaf pine on the ridge tops, and a lot of those were either cut or died naturally. But what we've been finding is that we have these old fire-scarred stumps that may have died 50, maybe even 100 years ago, or were harvested 100 years ago. But because of the resin and the fire scarring on the stumps, they're preserved fairly well, and we can really go back in time. And we've got some trees going back to about 1750. This particular sample here dated back to 1780. And you can see that where the fire scars occurred. So we're hoping to, in the next year or so, put together a nice fire history that goes further back based on these old pine remnant stumps at Shawnee State Forest. All right, well, we know that fires occurred at least in the 1800s a lot, and early 1900s. And then looking at, well, why would oaks do better in a regime of fire? Why would fire favor oaks and hickories? And they really have, I'll probably talk about oak mostly today, but it kind of including hickory because it has a lot of the same ecological attributes as oak. Oak has thick bark when you're talking trees, and you can see this was a tree, a chestnut oak tree. You can see the thick bark, and then also this was a prescribed fire that occurred back in the 1990s. When oaks are wounded by fire, when that vascular cambium is wounded and dies, they're very good at compartmentalizing those wounds by growing around the wound, and eventually that wound will even seal over and will cover the fire scar. So oaks have, the trees have those two adaptations. And then when you get down to the seedlings, really the major thing that favors oaks is they invest a lot to their root system. They have a root-centered growth. You can see here a red oak seedling with just a large taproot. And that allows, when there is a fire that comes through and top kills the stem, that allows for resprouting from the root collar. And because there's a lot of reserves down there, they can resprout after multiple fires. And also because acorns get buried in the soil, typically that dormant bud is located on the root collar, which is below the soil, which is then protected from fire, unlike some of the other species like red maple and yellow poplar. All right, so back in 1995, Elaine Sutherland, who was at the Forest Service at the time, began a study looking at it was called the Ecosystem Management Study, looking at the effects of repeated fires in oak ecosystems, and looking at the response of not only the trees and the regeneration, but also soil, the effects of fire on soil and breeding birds and several other components of the ecosystem. These were low-intensity, dormant season burns, and as far as the tree regeneration goes, we hypothesized that these repeated fires would reduce the density of mid-story and understory trees, which are predominantly the non-oaks. Red maple and sugar maple were fairly abundant in these stands, and that those fires would then eventually increase the competitive status of the oaks because they can resprout, and you're getting a little bit more light, getting more light to the forest floor, which could allow the oaks to grow more as well. All right, so we had a study design as we had a series of burned and unburned stands. This was kind of the final study set here. We lost a few of the study stands due to various reasons. So these final stands that we looked at in year 13 of the study were at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest, and we had 3 stands that were burned. 2 of those were burned 5 times, and 1 was burned 3 times. And then we had 2 unburned stands, and we had a series of plots where we monitored vegetation. And you can see the dates of the prescribed fires here. They were early, either late March or early April, dormant season fires, and for the most part they were all low intensity with flame lengths of typically 1 foot or 1 or 2 feet, but definitely not high intensity fires. And just some visuals of what the fires did. And one of the plots here, we have year 0. You can see that there's a lot of clutter in the understory and mid-story. And then this was year 4 after 2 burns that had started to open up somewhat. And then by year 13, we had 1 more burn in the stand. It's significantly more open. That understory has really opened up with those repeated burns. All right, this is show you a series of graphs here describing that show how the fires affected the structure of the forest. Starting with the larger trees, these are overstory trees, which would be greater than 10 inches diameter at breast height. These fires have very little effect on those trees. There was actually a 4% decrease over time on the unburned sites just due to natural mortality, but only a 10% decrease in the density of these larger trees on the burn sites. And these carets down here indicate the years where we had fires. Okay, then for the mid-story trees, though, these are trees that would be 4 to 10 inches DBH, and these were a lot of this was red maple. Also, some oak was in the mid-story. You can see there was a more significant decrease here, a 34% decrease in the density of those mid-story trees. As you would expect, these trees have thinner bark than the overstory trees. And then when we get to the saplings, these 1 to 4 inch stems, these were mostly all shade-tolerant species. You can see there was a pretty significant, pretty dramatic decline of a 78% decrease by year 13 in the density of those saplings. And here's just an example of what the repeated burns do to a red maple. This is probably maybe a 3-inch red maple sapling or pole that was in the mid-story before that first burn. And here, after the first burn, it resprouted, and you can see the sprouts grew to be maybe 6 or 7 feet tall. This was an area that had opened up a fair bit. But then the second burn, you can see, knocked that back down again. And each time, those maples don't invest a lot to roots, so each time they're top-killed, there's not a lot of root reserves. They can resprout, but if it's fairly shady, they're not going to be able to grow rapidly. And also, they're available for deer browsing each time they're top-killed and resprouted. So what we saw eventually, this was here by year 13, is some of those maples that were in the mid-story just sort of had a slow demise. This one, I think, blew over during a windstorm, but you can see that it's not sprouting at all. The repeated fires and the fact that maples don't compartmentalize their wounds well really weaken the stems, so they may not die after the first fire or the second fire, but eventually, especially those smaller maples, will succumb. All right, and this is what happened to canopy openness, the percent of open sky. Really not a dramatic effect here. We had on the unburned plots about 5% open sky, and by year 13 we only had 9% open sky, and that reflects the sort of low intensity nature of those burns. So with the understory remaining fairly shady, we really reduced the density of saplings substantially, but the oak regeneration, it kept resprouting, but it wasn't getting enough sunlight to really exhibit a lot of growth. It was probably putting growth down into the roots, and there was enough light for those seedlings to stay alive, but not enough to create large oak seedlings that were growing rapidly because the light was just too low. But what happened during this study was there was a white oak decline about 2003, after the study had been going on for 8 to 10 years. And at the Vinton Furnace experimental forest, where we had these research plots in burned and unburned stands, we saw these patches of white oak mortality that had been caused by insect defoliations and some climate conditions as well. And typically there was 1 to maybe a dozen oak trees that would die in patches, and that would create these small to medium-sized gaps in the canopy. And so what we observed then, walking through some of these burn stands, was now those oak seedlings that had remained small in the relatively shady conditions, when they were exposed to this high light environment, had rapid growth. And you can see here some white oak, which is typically the slowest growing of the oaks, exhibiting some rapid height growth after the formation of those canopy gaps in the burn stands, because there's not really that shade-tolerant mid-story to further impede the sunlight. So we wanted to capture this, and so we set up a separate study, sort of a parallel study, that focused on the canopy gaps within these same stands. And so in year 13, we went in and found 24 gaps that were in unburned units, and found 28 gaps that were in these burned units that had burned either 3 or 5 times. And we established plots within these canopy gaps to monitor tree regeneration. All right, so here's what happened here's what the structure of those gaps was within those gaps. For the 24 unburned gaps, these are saplings and poles, so 1 inch to 8 inches DBH. By year 13, the blue bars here represent the shade-tolerant species, and this was primarily red maple and beech and sugar maple and black gum. So those gaps were really dominated by these shade-tolerant saplings and poles. The oaks here are red, and there were a few gaps, unburned gaps, that had some oak saplings, but for the most part, there were very few oak saplings in these gaps. But when we went to the burned gaps, you can see that mid-story was greatly reduced in almost all the gaps. There were still some shade-tolerant species present, but the density was much less in those burned gaps, those 28 burned gaps. Each one of those bars is a separate gap. Now, when we move on to the large advanced regeneration, so now we're moving down from the sapling size class to the large advanced regeneration. These would be large seedlings that are greater than 2 feet tall, up to 1 inch in diameter. By year 13, in those unburned gaps, you can see that there's oak and hickory, there's sassafras, very little sassafras present, shade-tolerant species, but those densities tend to be in the 1 to 2,000 stems per acre. The oak and hickory averaged 468 per acre. And this is that important regeneration class that could really grow to fill that canopy gap, these larger seedlings and small saplings. But when we look at the burned gaps, you can see there's really a dramatic increase in the oak and hickory. We now have almost 3,000 oak and hickory stems per acre. There's also a lot more sassafras, which responds positively to the burning. But really, you know, oak and hickory is really quite dominant now in these burned gaps. All right, this is that same, just a couple years after the last fire, and then we see that same gap from a little bit different angle 5 years after the gap formation and 4 years since that last fire. That oak regeneration unit, you can see really growing rapidly here. You can see there's a person there in the center of that. All right, well, another interesting thing that we found in these canopy gaps is that they were really dominated by white oak. And I guess that on one level that's not surprising because there was a, you know, white oak was in the canopy here, but white oak was really quite dominant in these gaps. 67% of the oak stems were white oak, of these larger oak seedlings. And I think part of that was just the nature of the disturbances and how white oak grows compared to some of the other species. We can see that the root to shoot ratios, white oak really invests more into its roots. This is a study that Joanne Rebbeck did in the greenhouse looking at several different species. And white oak had seedlings after 2 years, had by far the highest root to shoot ratio, three times the root versus the shoot, while chestnut and red oaks were about 1.5 times more invested to the root versus the shoot. Well, you can see yellow poplar and red maple invest quite a bit less to the roots. That most of what's there is the shoot and not the root. So when these fires repeatedly top kill stems, for red maple and yellow poplar, those seedlings, we would have 60% of that seedling mass would be destroyed when it's top killed, because most of that seedling is above ground. For chestnut oak and northern red oak, we'd see 40% of that seedling mass would be destroyed. But for white oak, only 25, because most of the white oak is invested in the roots. Only 25% of the seedling mass is destroyed when it's top killed. And I think there's relatively shady conditions too. For the first part of this study, white oak is actually the most shade tolerant of the oaks, even though it does require highlight conditions to eventually get going. It is more shade tolerant than the other oaks. Now I'd like to switch gears a little bit from these repeated low intensity fires in mature stands, and would like to summarize. There's another technique that's been found very effective, which is called the Shelterwood burn method for improving oak regeneration. And this was originally developed and studied by Pat Brose and David Van Leer in the Piedmont of Virginia. And the treatment here is in a mature stand is to have a shelterwood cut, which reduces the basal area and cuts all the mid-story and even most of the smaller stems down to 1 inch or 2. It reduces the basal area by 50%. So this really creates an open stand. And in those highlight conditions, the tree regeneration can grow rapidly. And that would be the oaks and the competitors. And then 3 to 5 years after that regeneration has been allowed to develop, a burn is conducted, a single burn, and to favor the oaks over some of those other species. And they found that it worked very well, and the best results were when that fire was conducted, if that fire was fairly high intensity and also conducted in the growing season or the early growing season when things were starting to leaf out. And here's just some visuals. This is a Shelterwood cut at Vinton Furnace State Forest in Ohio. So you can see that there's still a fair bit of overstory there, but it's really quite open in the understory. This is right after the harvest, or right after the cut. This is the first growing season after the Shelterwood cut. And then by 5 years, under those highlight conditions, the regeneration really develops rapidly. And you can see there's a person in there recording data, but this is the time to think about, if the oaks are losing ground, to do that prescribed fire that would favor the oaks. And the results can really be quite dramatic. This is a picture from a photograph from that study in the Piedmont of Virginia. And what happened after this Shelterwood cut, this was on a pretty good site, and all these dead stems now, these were yellow poplar that germinated after the Shelterwood cut and were growing rapidly. But this early growing season burn actually killed all of these stems, and what you had left was the oak that was now free to grow in the understory. And the longer-term results of the study also showed that 10 or 11 years after these treatments, that the oaks were doing well in those areas that had had early growing season fires with fairly high intensity. And this is an early growing season burn that we did at the Vinton Furnace experimental forest a few years ago, showing that this was actually, you can see the white oak seedlings here had leafed out already. So this was done maybe a week or so after leaf out, but you can see that they all resprouted quite well. This is the first growing season after that fire. So, and again, because of those root reserves, it's probably knocking them back a little bit, but not as much as the competition, especially if it can be done early in the growing season. All right, now we had a study that's sort of similar to the Shelterwood burn study, or the Shelterwood burn method, but with a little bit of variation. And this was a study that began in 2000. It's the Fire and Fire Surrogate study, and this was a series of 13 study sites across the country that were focusing on using prescribed fire and mechanical thinning to look at the response of ecosystems that had historically had frequent fires, but there had been fire suppression and there had been a significant change. And it had sort of begun out in the ponderosa pine ecosystems of the West, but there were several eastern sites included as well. So in southern Ohio, the focus was really on looking at ecological restoration and comparing these treatments for opening up the stands and making them more sustainable from an oak regeneration standpoint, but also looking at things like animal and plant diversity, how these treatments affect other components of the ecosystem as well. All right, so we actually had, the study was conducted on 3 state forests in southern Ohio, the Vinton Furnace state experimental forest now, and then at Zaleski and Tar Hollow. And there was the commercial thinning that was conducted in the winter between 2000 and 2001. And it was not as heavily cut as in the Shelterwood burn method. It was not really a true Shelterwood. Basal area was reduced by 30%, but because it was a commercial thinning, they only cut stems down to about 6 inches in diameter. So some of those smaller stems that were 2 to 6 inches that would normally be cut in a Shelterwood harvest were not cut. So it did create more open conditions, but not extremely high light. So, and it really focused on retaining a canopy of oaks. There was no herbicide applied to the stumps, so things were allowed to resprout on those thinning units. And this increased the open sky more than it did in our burn-only study, from about 5% open sky to about 15% open sky right after the treatments. And then immediately we had prescribed fires that first spring after the thinning, and for the most part those fires were low intensity. There were a few places that had a little bit of overstory mortality, but generally low intensity fires like we'd had before. And what happened was a lot of the red maples that had been cut in the thinning then, because the fire was conducted in the early dormant season before they had resprouted, the fires did not hinder the resprouting. So after the fires had gone through, the red maple stumps, such as shown here, were allowed to resprout. And we also had a lot of establishment of yellow poplar on really across the landscape, particularly on the mesic sites. But after that thinning and the burning, there was lots of yellow poplar established. Then, so really, and I'll show some graphs that kind of highlight this, but really after that first fire, it seemed like the oaks were really losing ground because the red maples were sprouting and the yellow poplars had germinated and were growing rapidly. So that single fire in this case really didn't help matters at all as far as oak regeneration goes. Then we had the second and third burns were conducted on both the thin and burn units and the burn-only units in 2005 and then again in 2010. And this time the fires, because of weather conditions, also because we wanted to try to get a little bit higher intensity fires, and there were some downed fuels. Fuels were down and cured on this study from the thinning or from previous fires. Resulted in moderate to high intensity fires in 2005 and 2010. And this would be high intensity here, where we actually, had some places where flame lengths were 6 to 8 feet. And we had significant overstory mortality in patches. This, it wasn't across the entire stand, but tended to be on those southwest facing slopes. Some sites more than others. But this is probably more typical. This is at year 14 at Zaleski State Forest, where there's been a thinning, and then there's been, maybe a little bit of overstory mortality, but it's created this kind of a fairly open stand, but not with the high degree of overstory mortality that we saw in the previous slide. All right. Well, just recently, this is hot off the press here. Louis Iverson has been working on some analysis and a manuscript to look at the long-term effects on a series of grid points within 2 of the study sites on the FFS study. So within the study sites, there's a grid established of every 50 meters. There's a grid point where vegetation sampling is done. And this is across the landscape. And this study, this sort of a sub-study, was set up on just the thin and burn units at 2 of the sites, at Zaleski and at Remo, which is in the Vinton Furnace experimental forest, and then also the control sites. So we didn't study the burn only or the thin only, and we really wanted to see how things were changing across the landscape. This is an integrated moisture index that we'll talk about. It's the cool colors, such as the green, is north-facing slopes that tend to be, and lower slopes that tend to be mesic, and the red colors tend to be the southwest or west-facing slopes and upper slopes where conditions are more dry. This is based on GIS modeling of the landscape. And so within these grids, we looked at tree regeneration was sampled periodically from 2000 to 2013 at the 2 sites and just the two treatments. Okay, and here are some of the results for tree regeneration on the thin and burn sites only here. This is on seedlings, so stems that are less than 2 feet tall. For red maple, this will be a series of graphs where in each year, year 1 or year 0 before the treatments, 1, 4, 6, 9, and 13, vegetation was sampled, and you can see the dry grid points, the intermediate grid points are green, and then the mesic grid points are blue. And this is the density of red maple seedlings, and the treatments are indicated with thin and burn between year 0 and 1, and then the burns in years 5 and 10. And this is 1,000 seedlings or 1,000 stems per hectare. We had a lot of small red maple. A lot of these are just the new germinants that decreased after that first thinning and burning, but then they increased again. So we had similar by year 4, but then since then, with the 2nd and 3rd fires, we've had a pretty sharp decrease in the density of red maple seedlings. When we look at yellow poplar, again, after that thinning and burning, there was a dramatic increase from the seed bank in yellow poplar. Up on the mesic sites, we had up to 120,000 per acre, per hectare in this case. But we can see also, as with red maple, with repeated burns, as the seed bank has been depleted, we've seen the density of yellow poplar stems reduce quite a bit by year 13. When we look at oak and hickory seedlings, there hasn't been a dramatic effect. We see sort of a general increase over time, primarily, and the oaks and hickories are much more abundant on the intermediate and dry plots than on the mesic plots. But this was related to a strong mast year for chestnut oak, particularly in 2005. And so there's been an increase over time, but not a dramatic increase in the number of seedlings. Okay, so looking at just all the oak and hickory species together, when we compare the burn or the thin and burn treatment with the control treatment, with all those grid points that were on control plots, you can see there really hasn't been a big difference in density between the thin and burn and the control. It's been largely driven by 2 good mast years that sort of occurred not in synchrony on the two treatments, but generally the population of seedlings has not really been dramatically affected by these treatments. But now when we look at the larger seedlings, these are stems greater than 2 feet tall, up to 1 inch, so inch in diameter. These would be the large seedlings and small saplings. When we look at these sizes, we see some different trends. Again, you can see there was an initial after the thin and burn with the red maples resprouting. We had a development of a pretty strong red maple layer, but that has decreased over time with the second and third burns. For yellow poplar, we see a similar trend where all those seedlings that had germinated after the fire grew into this larger size class by year 4, but then those have continued to decrease with the second and third fires. There's been a downward trend. But quite the opposite when we look at oak and hickory now, looking at the large seedlings and small saplings. There was an increase by year 4, but as we've had those second and third fires, the oaks and hickories have continued to increase, primarily on the dry and intermediate plots. But these do represent about 75% of the landscape. Only about 25% of the landscape is in these mesic plots. So when we look at this larger oak reproduction, these large seedlings and small saplings, when we compare the thin and burn treatments here with the control treatments, there's really been a dramatic difference. There has been a little bit of an increase on the control grid points, but now we have, we've gone from having less than 500 of these saplings and large seedlings per hectare to 5,000 by year 13. So there's really been a dramatic increase in this larger size class as the conditions have opened up. And another thing we found, I don't have a graph of it here, but the degree of canopy openness after a certain point has not made a huge difference. So it didn't require to develop this large number of saplings. It didn't require that the fires be so intense that they killed a lot of overstory trees. If it could just have, if the fires were moderate intensity and created about 15% open sky, 10 to 15%, there tended to be just as many oak saplings as in those plots where fires had actually killed the overstory and created much higher light conditions. All right, another thing that we looked at on the FFS study was the effect of these treatments on plant diversity. And on the understory, so this would be the herbaceous and the woody species that grow, generally down on the forest floor, less than 1 meter or so in height. And here we looked at over time all 4 of the treatments on all three of the study sites. And you can see this a similar graph here where we've got the four treatments. Control is blue, thin is the green, the burn is red, and then the thin and burn is the maroon. And we look at the number of species per meter squared. So before the treatments in year 0, we had about 7 to 8 species in the understory per meter squared. And then as the treatment started, that immediately increased on the thin and burn plots, but not the thin only plots. So we've really had this, and the gap has continued to widen a little bit over time, so that we now have about 12 species per meter squared on plots that have been burned or thinned and burned, and still about 7 to 8 species on either the control or the thin only plots. And these tended to be herbaceous species primarily that were increasing. Some were from the seed bank, and some were not from the seed bank. Here you can see one of the seed banking species that you can, right after, this is the percentage of quadrats of small sample plots that this species occurred in. So the first species here is rubus or brambles. When we had the first thin and burn, there was a lot of these seeds are in the seed bank. There was a response, and they've kind of continued to increase somewhat over time, but it was really a seed bank response from rubus. Whereas we look at the blue-stemmed goldenrod, which is a goldenrod that's fairly shade tolerant and grows kind of in a lot of different places on the landscape. There was not a seed bank response after those first treatments. But then over time, as those stands began opening up, and as the established plants began producing more seed, eventually we really see an increase in some of those species. A lot of these were asters and goldenrods that showed this sort of delayed response that was not from the seed bank. All right, then sometimes it can be a little bit abstract to just look at species diversity. So I just wanted to pull out one single quadrat that was sampled over time. This is a 1 meter squared quadrat at Zaleski State Forest, and just to kind of look at on the ground how species composition changed from year 0 to year 13. For the herbaceous species, this was a burn-only plot, so we had three fires here. In 2000, before the treatments, there were 2 herbaceous species that made up about 1% cover, and as far as woody species in 2000, there were 5 species that made up about 4.5% cover. So this was a very shady understory where there wasn't a lot of diversity on the forest floor. By 2014, you can see we now have 12 native species of herbaceous plants, 19% cover, and the number of woody species increased from 5 to 8, but the cover also increased dramatically from 4.5% up to 70% cover of woody plants. So this is maybe a little bit more dramatic response than average, but it just shows that how this disturbance can really stimulate the establishment of new plants and new growth when the midstory is opened up. And especially when the leaf litter is burned off, that really allows germination of some species that are either in the seed bank or actively producing seed. All right, we also, when we look at non-native species, this is always a concern when there's disturbance, is what's going to happen to the non-native species. And this is by year 14 here. We can see that the main invasive species on our study sites are Ailanthus, and then Microstegium, or Japanese silkgrass, wineberry, which is primarily just at the Tar Hollow site, and then multiflora rose. And there's definitely more. This is the percent of quadrats that have one of these species. This is increased at Rima and Zaleski, but there's still not. It has not been a dramatic increase. Where we really saw the increase was at the thin and burn unit at Tar Hollow, which had a lot of Ailanthus and wineberry were hanging around before the treatments, and then the treatments, both the thinning and then the burning, which was high intensity in some areas, created better conditions for these to establish. So it wasn't universal that we had a lot of establishment of non-native species, but if they're already there, they should really be treated first and to try to reduce that chance of what will happen after the disturbance. All right, and this has led to a study by Joanne Rebbeck. There was a call for proposals to look at the effects of fire on non-native invasive species in the eastern U.S. And Joanne received a grant from the Joint Fire Science Program to look at Ailanthus at Tar Hollow State Forest. This is an aerial view showing the female Ailanthus trees that have these persistent seed pods, and it's really quite abundant on the landscape of Tar Hollow State Forest. And so one of the objectives was to establish a grid here. This was about a 10,000 acre portion, the southern portion of Tar Hollow State Forest, where there had been prescribed burning, there had been timber harvesting, and other disturbances. We established a grid point of every 400 meters to look at whether Ailanthus was present, and then also what other species were there, and what conditions were like on those grid points, so to kind of get a handle on how it was distributed across the landscape. And we don't have any permanent results yet. We're still working on those, but for the take-home message has been that prescribed fire alone has not really led to a greater chance of there being Ailanthus in those burn units. It's really been the timber harvesting that has favored the establishment of Ailanthus and other things like places along roadsides, but the prescribed fire has not had a large effect on the presence of Ailanthus on that landscape. And the second goal in Joanne's study is to actually do some prescribed burning where Ailanthus is present in stands, and to look at the response of Ailanthus to fire. And you can see with trees here, these are Ailanthus trees. Basically, when these were present and there was a prescribed burn that was conducted, the trees were always top-killed. Most of the trees were top-killed because they do have thin bark, but they sprouted like crazy. So fire alone is not going to be a tool to get rid of Ailanthus. The herbicide on a subset of the plots, there was herbicide, or there was herbicide and burn that was done to these Ailanthus trees. The herbicide was very effective in killing about 75% of the trees. But interestingly, where we had the herbicide and then the burn together, about 99% of the Ailanthus trees were dead and not sprouting. What we did, another part of this is to look at in those burn sites the population of Ailanthus seedlings. Are those prescribed fires facilitating Ailanthus? And you can see that after the prescribed fires here on the burn and no herbicide, or the burn and herbicide, we do have more Ailanthus seedlings. So they're in the seed bank. We know it does have a persistent seed bank, and so those fires and disturbance is facilitating the establishment. But what Joanne, this is just anecdotal at this time, but what she's finding in longer-term monitoring is that in a lot of places those seedlings are getting out-competed, sometimes by some of the other sort of aggressive species like wineberry, the other invasive, or by native rubus. But if the conditions remain, depending on the competition, a lot of those seedlings are not competing very well. All right, so the conclusions then from these two studies, from our ecosystem management study where we had the repeated low-intensity fires, what we saw was that those fires reduced the density of shade-tolerant species like red maple and sugar maple in the understory and midstory. And the more diffuse light then that came in, even though it wasn't highlight conditions, probably favored root development in the oaks, particularly the white oaks. And then when those gaps formed after there had been several burns, that is when those oaks that had been socking away some energy to the roots were really released and started to grow rapidly and became very competitive and dominant in a lot of those canopy gaps. So really that combination of having some low-intensity burns followed by a canopy disturbance was very effective. With the fire and fire surrogate study, we found that this, similar to the EM, the early results were not encouraging, but then when we had repeated fires, we did eventually see that oak was gaining competitive stature in the understory, particularly over the species red maple and yellow poplar, which tended to decline after the second and third fires, while the density of oak saplings was increasing. And we also, we had on this study, we had some moderate intensity fires and some high intensity fires that may not be desirable, certainly for foresters, because they did cause a lot of overstory mortality. So we sort of pushed the envelope there. But what we found was that with the oak regeneration anyway, was that those high intensity fires were not required, that the moderate intensity fires that maybe had just very minor overstory mortality coupled with the thinning still produced a large number of oak and hickory saplings without the overstory mortality. And then we also saw that it's really fire. It's not the canopy disturbance as much as it is the fire that really stimulates the native herbaceous plants, and that increases diversity. But you also have to be aware that fire disturbance can certainly cause, if there are non-native invasive species on the landscape, that can increase the establishment and growth of those species as well. All right, so I just kind of in summary of fire as a tool in southern Ohio forests and in central hardwood forests, I think that where it's really valuable, you can see in these pictures here, is where you have a lot of small shade-tolerant species, and you may have plenty of oak regeneration that's kind of hanging around on the forest floor, but it's typically getting shaded out or getting overtopped by these small stems. And this is, from a land management perspective, it's really difficult to go in and try to do another treatment such as an herbicide on all of these small stems. I think this is where fire, at least in mature stands, can really be effective, and is in reducing this density of smaller stems that can be very labor and time consuming to treat. But it's a problem though, because currently prescribed fire can't really be done on private lands, which is where most of the forest is in southern Ohio. So there really is a need to, hopefully in the future, fire can be used as a tool on private lands, or we really need to develop some other tools that that can be used to get rid of these smaller stems and to favor oak regeneration if fire is not an option. Okay, and then I'd like to put in a couple plugs here for if you want to learn a lot more about this topic. There's been a really nice synthesis of the fire oak research that's been completed recently by Pat Brose and Dan Day and Tom Waldrop of the Forest Service. And this kind of summarizes there's really been quite a bit of research in the last 20 years on fire and oak. And some of the chapter topics include fire history of eastern North America, adaptations of oak to fire, and review of all those studies. And really the important part is from taking all that information, and they provide some guidelines for using fire in oak ecosystems, both from a forestry aspect and a wildlife aspect and an ecological restoration. And this is a report that can be found online at Tree Search, which is the Forest Service publications. And I highly recommend, if you want to know and have a good reference on the subject, to look into this. And then, because I know this is a wildlife audience and I didn't really talk about wildlife at all, I wanted to put in a plug for a webinar that I really enjoyed and learned a lot from. It was by Dr. Craig Harper at University of Tennessee. And it was a webinar that was done for the Oak Woodland and Forest Fire Consortium. Here's the website, and it was using prescribed fire to manage wildlife habitat in the Mid-South. So focused a little bit more south, but it's nice because it covers some of the specific things you want to do for certain wildlife species, and covers both forest habitats and more open habitats, and some of the other treatments to use in combination with fire, and how it affects wildlife. So I would recommend that. And I'd like to acknowledge, a lot of these long-term studies, there's way too many people to acknowledge, but we've always had great field support from our crew at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest, including David Hosak and Bill Borovica, Levi Miller, Dave Runkle, and then a lot of summer students who have helped out on the studies. And I'd like to thank also Tim, Fox, and Joanne for helping here at the lab in support of these projects. ODNR Forestry and the Wayne for providing study sites, and then funding came from the Forest Service and also from the Joint Fire Science Program. Okay, and with that, I'd be happy, that's the last slide here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Todd. I really appreciate this presentation. If anybody has questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and then I'll read them off for Todd. But since we don't have any questions right now, I'll ask one, and that is, Todd, do you have a recommended interval for the fires, the return interval?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't really talk a lot about that. I mean, I think, in that first study, we found that we could actually burn annually. We had 4 fires that occurred every spring at the beginning of that study. But I think that's really unnecessary, because the fuels don't build up enough to have you have really low intensity fires as you continue burning. So I think ideally if you could burn on in these mature stands, if you could burn on maybe a 2 to 3 year cycle, I think that would be good. I think when the stands, like in the Fire and Fire Surrogate study, we really had those higher intensity fires and opened the stands up more. And I think the more often you would burn, you would have more herbaceous, you'd have more dominance by herbaceous species. But if you're only burning every, let's say, 5 to 10 years, that really gives the woody vegetation time to get dominant again and create sort of thickets of woody vegetation. So it would really just depend on what type of structure you want to get. I think for the oak regeneration part of it, either one of those could be fine, either having more frequent or less frequent fires.
Great. And then another question is, how do you incorporate this with harvesting? Do you start fires right away, or do you wait till they reach a certain height or a certain time before you actually want to harvest?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think with the if you're starting burning in a mature stand where the oak regeneration is all small, you really want to whether it's fire or whatever treatment you're doing, you really want to develop that advanced regeneration to where you have larger oak seedlings and small saplings. And there's a tool that's very valuable for that. It's a Silva program. It's a sampling methodology and a computer program where you can use that to survey a stand and to determine, and it'll give you recommendations based on the size of the oak regeneration and also the competitors. When would be a good time to harvest, and do you want to do a complete harvest, or do you just want to, if the oak regeneration is still not getting very large, you may want to just do a partial harvest to get more light to the forest floor but not simulate competitors. So yeah, Oak Silva is a great tool for kind of giving guidelines on when to harvest. Now with the Shelterwood burn method, if you've got oak regeneration that's on the forest floor, that Shelterwood cut, you can go ahead and do that and just let everything grow up in those high light conditions. And then it would be a matter of, typically in a silviculture, in a Shelterwood sequence, that the Overstory would then be removed from 5 to 15 years after that initial Shelterwood cut. But that would also depend on, whether that fire really favored the oak, dominance.
What is the probability of fire becoming available as a tool for private landowners in Ohio?
Boy, that's a good question. That's not really my area of expertise right now. I can say that that it does seem to be a lot more common in states where there's more prairie habitat and there's a lot of burning that goes on in private lands, especially where there's grazing. As you get further out west in the central hardwoods, I really can't say as for Ohio's future. We're hopeful. We're starting the Ohio Prescribed Fire Council is getting underway, and hopefully that might be an organization that can over time can help to get the use of prescribed fire increased on private lands.
All right, well, I've answered all the questions. Again, thank you for the presentation today, and thank you everyone who logged in to watch it. And that's all. Bye.
Okay, thanks, Ken.